Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate that.
This project is very impressive.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I think it's wonderful, and I think it's going to be great because you're hitting it from many different angles.
Yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. This is a story that needs to get outside the narrow boxes and the little arguments that have gone on, and step back and bring people into a deeper first-person understanding of this. You know, that there's just too much. There's too much at stake here.
Well, so far, society has functioned pretty much as disablers for individuals who have difficulty with reading, and we need to learn how to become enablers rather than disablers.
Excellent, absolutely. Maybe we could start by you giving me a little background sketch, how it is that you got into all of this, and a brief tour of your career.
Well, okay, it's a little complicated. I started out and I graduated from Stanford in the drama department, and then I became fascinated by the idea that there were kids who had difficulty with communication, because as a prospective or wannabe actress, communication was very important. And so I found out, this was a long, long time ago, and there was only one program in the country, on the West Coast, where they had speech path, speech pathology and audiology.
Right.
And that was Jim Carroll's program at the University of Washington. So I went up there and decided I should get my master's in speech pathology, because I was fascinated by these children who couldn't communicate.
Yeah.
And then it became a little apparent, quite apparent. Jim sent me to Columbia to work on my PhD, and it became very apparent that the children who we worked with in the preschool clinics, children who had delay in expressing themselves, when they went to school, they couldn't learn to read. And they were then, this was in the early 40s, put into classes for the emotionally disturbed or the retarded. And their parents were upset because these kids were obviously not retarded.
Right.
And no parent wants to think of her child or his child as being emotionally disturbed. So the parents were upset, and so were the speech pathologists. And at that time, the field of medicine was primarily concerned with adult rehabilitation. And I was in education, and I was young and female, and people didn't want to talk about the habilitation of children, which is the workplace, which is school, which is learning, which is reading. And so finally decided, well, if you can't lick them, you should join them. So I made a deal with Columbia and got my pre-med done in a year, and was, by the grace of God, accepted at McGill University for med school. And at that time, there weren't too many schools, medical schools, taking girls.
So you actually bumped up against the wall and decided that you were going to get through this and turned your direction into the medical to stay on the beam of learning your way into this.
Yeah, because I figured that the first professional that parents go to if there's trouble is a pediatrician.
Oh, beautiful.
And I figured that they needed to know about children and learning and reading and communication. So I decided I wanted to do pediatrics and go into the teaching end of it. And I was very fortunate. I don't want to go into it, but I was very lucky. And I was sent down by my chief at Children's Hospital in Montreal to meet with Sidney Farber, who was sort of the god of pediatrics in New England, all over the country, I guess. And Dr. Farber, whose real specialty was cancer in children, I was interested because he thought there should be a speech clinic in a children's hospital, which we didn't have at that time anywhere. And so my chief, knowing my background, Dr. Goldblum, sent me down to meet with Dr. Farber. And the end of that is that I was taken on at Children's Hospital in Boston to set up the first speech clinic in any children's hospital in the country.
Wow.
And so that was my beginning, and then I married a pediatric surgeon, so I went where he went, and had a couple of children of my own, and I retired for a few years so I could be with them when they were preschool. And then we went to Oklahoma because Bill was he was taken on as chief of surgery at Children's Hospital there, and I got a grant from the NIMH to establish a child study center, which ostensibly was to evaluate children who were considered to be retarded. And it turned out that a large proportion of these children who were sent to us were kids who couldn't read, and who were considered to be stupid. And so while there, we mostly saw kids with reading disabilities, and I set up a diagnostic preschool. You can't make a diagnosis of reading disability in a preschooler who's not supposed to be reading, but who does show signs of possibly being at risk.
Right.
And I figure you have to work with the children to see those. You don't get that on a physical examination, usually. And so that's why I always had a diagnostic preschool wherever I worked. And
that's quite an elaborate, beautiful story of the design of your own learning environment.
Well, it was, I have felt all my life blessed because people seem to help me go in the right direction. So anyhow, that's what I've been doing, and I guess I would be called a developmental pediatrician, and I've always had joint appointments either with psychiatry or speech and hearing in pediatrics, and have had my own clinics in learning.
Wow. And so this led you, of course, to the connection between the oral language processing and phonology.
Yeah, and that was a story, too, because I was president of the American Speech and Hearing Association in 1973. I think I was the second female they finally put in there. And in my acceptance address, when what is it when you're going out of office, your final address? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I made the statement that we as a profession had abrogated, that I thought that we as a profession had abrogated our responsibility to children with learning disabilities because the majority of them were children with language disorders, and they were our children. And when they went to school, they became part of special education, and they were still really our kids. Well, I got hell for this. It was considered heresy, practically. People came up and they said, "You should never have said that. We have nothing to do with reading. This is speech and hearing. This is speaking and hearing. We're not teachers. And I said, we don't have to be teachers, but they're still our kids." Anyhow, now that was in 73, and now, finally, ASHA begins to feel like they know a lot about reading disability. So they finally made the connection between speaking and reading. It's all one thing. It's all language.
Right. Huh.
But I got in a lot of trouble then.
I'll bet. There's somewhat of a cross at this stage with other work that's going on in the world about establishing this connection, yeah?
Yeah.
And so how does this lead to Orton and the work that you did there?
Oh, well, ASHA and Orton always had their conferences at the same time, so I never could go to both. And I was always interested in what went on over in Orton. And, to lead into that, when I was in Oklahoma and directed the Child Study Center, a very good friend of mine was the head of a preschool, and she and I both were bootlegging Montessori.
Right.
We had no training, but we had materials, and to me this was sort of an important piece of the diagnostic process in the preschool, working with kids using some of the materials from Montessori.
Which would help draw you into a different kind of rapport and relationship than standing apart from them and executing some model of what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Peggy and I got hold of Lena Vikramaratna, who we found out was in Missouri at the time, and we talked her into coming down to Oklahoma and training us. And I just told my gals, I had 2 speech and language people working for me, and we got a hold of one of the best 3rd grade teachers in the city, regular ed, and we all took the training, which took us a year. And so I got my Montessori diploma, and that, of course, pushed me right into the whole concept of utilization of multisensory techniques.
Right.
And for the very young child, from my point of view, this is essential.
Yeah, that's the way they're wired to learn.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So I have combined that with everything else. Well, that was when I finally was able to go into to get to Orton meetings. I began to attend those instead of ASHA because that had to do more with what I was concerned with at the time, and still am. And I love the multisensory approach, the structured language approach that they like, and it seems to work very well with many children. They don't necessarily have to be dyslexic, they're just kids who have trouble reading. And so I've been in what is now called the International Dyslexia Association. When I was president, it was still Orton. But so there I am.
Wow, it's a fascinating story. Thank you. You know, I have so many people that I have bumped into in my journey in trying to tell the story that we're telling. I have overlap, not so much in obviously the specifics, but in the sense of driving their own learning towards helping children in this zone, and the path that formed in their lives as they learned their way into that.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating, the way that I look at it is, even though I talk with people that would be in pretty significant disagreement about what we should do.
Right.
The one thing that seems to be common across the lot is that we could step back and say, if we take a look at any of our big human problems, and we care and we look for more than one generation down the road, the most precious resource on this planet is how well the children learn.
That's right.
I mean, there's just nothing anywhere near as important to everything as how well the children learn.
Yes, and they're not going to learn a hell of a lot unless they learn how to read.
Well, yes, and it's
and the alphabet to me is absolutely, the history of the alphabet's fascinating to me.
Yes. So that's I noticed your reference to Logan. Logan's book was a big thing for me when it first came out in the 80s.
Yeah.
I had been working on what I call the inner interface, the way that the organic, natural, human learning systems want to function, and then the artificial learning systems that are on the other side of becoming symbolically abstract and using things like the alphabet and so forth. And how do they interface? How do those two get together? How do they work together? Yeah. And it was in my work about that I encountered Logan, which was one of the first...
I loved his book.
Yeah. Have you read David...
Alphabetic Principle. Yeah. What?
Yeah, the alphabet effect. Yes. Did you read The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abrams?
No.
You'd love it.
Oh boy, good. The Spell of the Sensuous?
The Spell of the Sensuous.
Oh, that sounds pretty sexy.
It builds off of the work that Logan did. It's a much more, it's a much better piece of work than
What's his name?
David Abram.
Okay. Abram with no S.
No S.
Okay.
Let me double check that. Did you read The Alphabet versus the Goddess?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I had to say, I could hear in your tone, I had the same reaction.
Yeah.
But that was... David Abrams' work belongs with a kind of a heartful philosophical spin that's grounded more in Logan's approach.
Yeah.
I think you'd like it.
Thank you.
You bet. It is with an S. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not.
Oh, okay.
It's not.
I got it with no S.
No S. Okay. Anyway, what we're doing with regard to that, of course, is telling the story of the alphabet in a way that's similar to describing its effect both on consciousness and the infrastructure of processing and on civilization, without necessarily getting into the East-West thing, but just in terms of the fundamental enabling technology that the alphabet was to everything about the way Western civilization had developed.
Yeah, well, without it, I mean, we couldn't order words in the dictionaries. We couldn't find things in the encyclopedia. We couldn't find books in libraries. We couldn't put them all there. Yes,
and on top of those level of skills, there's a growing argument from people like Stanovich, who does he does for the mind, and you'll see in Abrams that from different angles, that what we're talking about is learning to deal with this abstract information processing technology called the alphabet has created a capacity for abstraction, generalization, critical thinking, self-reflection,
organization,
and it's changed the way our oral language system works. It's not just like writing got added to it; writing changed it. So we're telling that story. But the interesting thing for us, which connects more with your orthography phonology conversation that we need to go to, is what happened that's so unique in the fall of the Roman Empire and the conscription of the alphabet system to be used in these other languages that didn't evolve together the same way. Where, as you probably know, or if you read the interview we did with John Fisher, in the 1400s, King Henry V decides he needs to be able to communicate with English-speaking nobles who have money he needs for the campaigns in Europe, and gets his French and Latin-based scribes in concert with him to begin what would be the English writing system. And not a one of them really cared anything about English. In that the English language at this point in time, according to the people that I'm talking to, is basically a peasant language. And they didn't have words for complex business operations or science or, religious...
Well, the alphabet came about because they had to, because of recording quantitative data. That's how they started writing. When way back...
Oh, yeah, the beginning was scratching on bones and icons and all this stuff was...
they had clay tokens.
Yeah, receipts, really.
Huh?
Receipts.
Yeah, and then in 8000 BC, for God's sake, they were putting these clay tokens in little bags.
Right.
And then they found out they could use a symbol system to say how many were in there.
Right. Right. We will tell that story. In fact, we're going to do a morph that begins with somebody scratching on a bone and then goes to...
Knotted strings.
Yes, knotted strings, and the making token objects and sticking them in pots, and then instead of you sticking them in the pots, impressing them in the pots, and then instead of impressing them, scribing them, and then instead of the pots and the tablets, the paper, and it'll all kind of blur together in a neat image.
Yes, I remember those where they put them in envelopes called bully.
Yeah.
L-L-I-E-A-E, I think.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah,
but
it's wonderful.
The key point for us is that as you know, at the emergence of the original use of the alphabet by the Greeks and the Romans subsequently, the thing was phonetic. For the most part, it was phonetic.
That's right.
Right? And there's a problem that happens only 600 years ago that's only been really a challenge to the past 10 or 20 generations, so it has no evolutionary support, which is that whereas the original users of the alphabet could see a letter and immediately articulate its sound and blend it together into code-cued speech, today, the challenge that's faced by people trying to learn our written system in particular is they can no longer do that. The letter has to be recognized but suspended and then worked out to disambiguate the letter's possible sounds into the actual sound it's going to make in the context of the word that it's in.
Yeah.
That level of processing is an alien processing challenge to the human brain.
Right, well, yeah.
That's
because speaking is innate for us.
right.
That's built in. But reading is a whole new thing that has to be taught.
Right, and it's based on a technology that we've been radically negligent about.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. One of my most favorite little pieces that I adore came out of, you know, when you go to hotels, they have these guideposts, those little things you read.
Yes.
Okay, there was one in there in a guidepost, and it said, "Isn't it amazing?" I'm reading this. "Isn't it amazing how we take them for granted? Those little black marks on paper. 26 different shapes known as letters arranged in endless combinations known as words. Lifeless until someone's eye falls on them. And then a miracle happens. Along the optic nerve, almost at the speed of light, these tiny symbols are flashed to the brain where they're instantly decoded into ideas, images, concepts, meanings. The eye's owner is changed too. The little black marks can make him love or hate, laugh or cry, fight or run away. And what do we call this incredible chain of events? Reading.
Yeah, I love
the spoken word rushes by and it's gone, but the written word endures. It can be consulted over and over again forever. But isn't that lovely?
It is lovely. And there's a point in it that in that instant that happens between the letter being recognized and the decoding is everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a conversation with Keith Rayner today. Do you know of his work?
No, I don't.
He's the guy that brought he's the one that brought eye scanning technology to watching the behavior of the eyes and the number of times they made fixations during the reading process, and then inferred from that how does that connect to the different cognitive processes associated with processing the code. And
fascinating.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dimension of this. But the point is that what they've been able to determine for a good reader is that it takes about 5 milliseconds to recognize the orthography, and right behind it comes the phonology, in about 20 milliseconds. And right there is where the kids that have trouble, and that difference between 5 to 20 milliseconds and 50 milliseconds is reading. So let's, it's just a delight to talk with you. Let's step back and give me your sense of the multisensory approach, the thing that you think is the model of reading that most fits for you. And also, as we go here, please feel free to tell me any jewels or stories or things that pop to you that you think would be helpful for people to understand.
Okay. Well, to me, children from the beginning learn through all of their senses. This is the beginning of learning,
right?
From infancy, and it's through all of the senses that things begin to make sense, because they begin to relate what they see with what they hear, with what they can feel and touch and do, and they also learn through movement, manipulation of objects. How do they learn abstracts like hot or cold? They have to feel something that's hot or get the idea of hot from reality. It's too abstract a concept.
Right, they're wired up for proprioceptive learning, self-perception through their total physical being.
Yeah, see, you talk better than I do.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Oh, you do. You say it nicely. I sort of use jargon. But this is the beginning of learning. And when a child has to see, the right hemisphere is very active. I was taught when I went to medical school, which was in the 40s, the right hemisphere was kind of deaf and dumb. It didn't do much. And now we've learned to the contrary, it does a great deal. But it's responsible for example, for recognizing familiar shapes. That's the alphabet. It's responsible, more important, for recognizing the prosodic features of the language, the inflectional patterns of language. This is the melody of language that the baby tunes into.
It's also connected to the affect system in us, so that there's an affective carrier wave. That's how they feel the meaning.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's all connected together. But they have to use all of this early stuff, the recognition of unfamiliar shapes, the recognition of prosodic features, how words go up or sentences go up or sentences go down, or they can identify before they're 2 whether parents are angry or not. They recognize these things, but it all comes in through senses, and all of them are hooked together.
Yes.
You can't separate them in any way. And so when children first see the unfamiliar shapes of letters, and people are talking about alphabet and so on, a lot of these kids, most of the kids, for some reason, in some miraculous way, have already figured out that every word is composed of different sounds, that each word has, different sounds in it.
Yeah,
different letters.
Yeah.
So they were able, without a great deal of difficulty, to connect the idea that if you see this particular shape, it goes with this particular sound. And they can make that connection. Our kids can't do that. They don't have the awareness that these words are made up of different sounds, that they don't get rhyme. You can catch that by the time they're 3 or 4. Excuse me, I have to drink because my voice begins to give out.
Yeah, no, take care of your voice, of course.
But at any rate, we have to be able to help them as soon as we recognize that there's a lack of connecting, a disconnection between what this looks like and what it sounds like. That's when we have to start working with them. And I think that when we don't start until kids are in 3rd and 4th grade, it's way the hell too late. We're missing out a tremendous opportunity because it has to start preschool. It has to start in the very beginning, where we begin to work with the kids utilizing combinations of utilization of all of the senses. To make a stroke with a pen. Oh, God. I'll free associate one on that one. Writing. This is something I have recently learned that teachers are sending children to occupational therapists because they don't know how to write well. Well, hell, I'm old, and in my day, our teachers taught us how to write. How to make rows and rows and rows of A's and so on. Right.
We learn by doing it more and more and more.
Yes. So you have to start. That's again. This is where Montessori comes in, because she utilizes children learn to trace, to use contours, shapes, and they do this. And when they're 3 and 4, they draw every single day. And they learn to hold the mechanics of writing, how to hold a pencil, how to sit when you hold it. This, to me, is also part of speaking is a motor act, writing is a motor act.
Right, and in both cases, again, you can feel what you're doing.
Yes, yes, exactly. Linda Moot does that very well with her speaking stuff. The idea that you can feel what your articulatory muscles are doing, and you can feel what your hand is doing, and it's connected to what your eyes are doing. And even, my God, the Russians way back, Vygotsky, Zaporozhets, they did wonderful experiments with little kids and showed that the eyes follow the hand. The hand doesn't follow the eyes. But they worked with 3-year-olds. And showed that the eyes followed the hands. So working with small children and motor activities like speaking and writing is also leading into reading. It's leading into reading and writing both. writing in the cognitive sense.
Right.
Unless you can handle the mechanics of writing, you're not going to be able to express your thoughts very well in writing. And most all of the literature now talks about writing, but they're talking about the cognitive aspect, and they forget about preparing the children.
Yeah, there's actually a number of people that are starting to advocate, let the reading thing lag and have kids practice writing the alphabet, and that the closer kids get to writing the alphabet in under a minute, the better off they are and the less trouble they're going to have reading.
Well, if you read Montessori's work, most of her kids wrote before they read.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, because you have to it has to go together. And seeing it and saying it and hearing it and doing it all at the same time seems to me to be a more physiological approach to working with little kids.
Well, it's certainly going to give them a better access and a better ground to those experiences. And one of the things that's confusing, though, is that reading has to happen faster than we can think about.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas writing and even spelling and what have you is happening in an entirely different timescape.
Yeah. Got it. Mhm. Right. And and speaking is involved there too.
Yes.
Because there are people who are extremely articulate and marvelous speakers who have a hell of a time writing.
Yes.
And there are people who have a very difficult time speaking who can write magnificently.
Yes, yes.
And that time-lapse thing that you just talked about, I think, is what's crucial there.
Right. That's what we're at the science center of all this. What we're interested in is how all these different layers of processing have to synchromesh and work together in this very narrow, precarious time window in order for this not to all break down.
And from my point of view, the mesh is easier to achieve if you start when they're very little.
Yes.
Because that's when the real mesh begins to happen.
Yeah.
And there are children who miss out on that. It's not just the underprivileged kids. They have a harder time because they don't hear any good language.
Right.
They don't produce it.
They're not in a language environment that's rich with distinction and speed.
Well, not only that, I'm thinking of bilingual kids now. And under that category, I place the African American kids. They are bilingual just as much as the Hispanic child is. They have their own code. Their code is grammatically correct for them. If a child says, "My uncle be sick," it's quite different from "my uncle is sick." If he be sick, it's chronic. If he is sick, it's acute.
Yeah, right.
That's their grammar.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Their pronunciation is part of their linguistic code.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, then you look at somebody like Sidney Poitier, or any other educated, well-spoken, as we would say, well-spoken black.
Like Denzel Washington.
Yes.
Right.
This guy can switch code.
Yes.
Now, this is something that needs to be taught to the children, that it's okay to switch code. And
not to be ashamed of their their first developed code system.
First language.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the Spanish kids or the Mexican kids. They have to learn to switch code. They can speak their own language, but they also need to learn to speak the language of the school and the community and the workplace.
Yeah, and we've got to get that part going at the oral language level before we overemphasize reading, or we're going to create a big problem.
Exactly. It starts with spoken language always.
Yep. Yeah, it's amazing to me how many people are trying to teach ESL reading. I've talked with the linguists in China that they're racing off to teach reading before there's a vocabulary ground or an oral language structure to support it.
Yeah. One of my sons adopted 2 Russian children, and the boy, Will, was 6. His sister was 18 months when they were adopted and came to this country. Well, Anna, the little girl, has had no difficulty with language at all. She's extremely verbal, and she's an all-American little kid already. You know, I mean, no problem there.
Mm-hmm.
But Will was fluent in Russian. He knew the Cyrillic alphabet. And when he came over, he got here in April. This was 6 years ago, or more, maybe more. Anyhow, his father put him in an ESOL class for the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And pulled him out. He said, hell, the teacher didn't speak Russian. What good was she going to do to him?
Yeah.
So they immersed him in language and English at home. And they took him to museums. They took him every place, and it was all English. That's all he heard. And he went into a regular first grade and did fine. He was slower in reading, slower in language. The difficulty, he still has he's 12 now, and he's all A's and B's in school, but he still has difficulty with the vernacular, street language. He doesn't always get the kids' jokes.
Yeah, then that's a third code.
Yeah, that's right. But he was immersed.
Right.
And has done great. And I don't understand what's happened in our educational system. They always used to be immersed. My mom was Viennese and came to this country with no English. She spoke 6 languages, but no English. She was an opera singer. And she immersed herself, and she learned to speak English. And she told me, she said, my goodness, she said all of the foreigners that she knew, living in their little locations, their, what do you call them, their sections in New York.
Mm-hmm.
The Italians all live together, Spanish live together, Germans, and so on.
Right.
She said, all of them kept telling their children, you go to school, you learn to speak English, you're an American, then you come and teach me.
Yeah. Yes. Huh.
And so now we've gone into this complete nutty...
The whole education now reflects the crude mechanics of its management systems.
Yeah.
Yeah?
That's well put.
And because the management systems are so crude, they can't measure, assess, and improve where they want to improve in anything that can't be recognized by the sensor system of the management machine.
Yeah.
And
how old are you?
I'm 51. Just turned 51.
Well, you're very brilliant.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm on a mission, just like you were. I'm also being blessed by what's unfolding before, pursuing that mission.
Yeah, it's wonderful what you're doing.
Thank you. Wonderful what you've done and what you're doing. I think that my heroes are the people like you that have stepped up and lined their life up with stewarding the health of children's learning.
Well, that's the most important thing we have for our future.
Yeah, I certainly believe that.
Yeah.
And that ultimately that comes down to how well they participate from the inside out and what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the... I have a grandchild who has been slow to pick up reading.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she was in pre-me and so forth and so on. And she was, they decided to hold her back in kindergarten. And her father said to me that, they were so worried that she would lose her self-esteem. And I said, for God's sake, this child already has been losing self-esteem. She knew before you knew that she wasn't doing what she should be doing in kindergarten.
Right.
She knew already that there were kids who were doing more than she could do, even though they weren't any smarter than she was.
Yes, whether or not she made that particular last analytical assessment, we don't know, but she's definitely, yes, she could feel the difference.
No. They know.
Yeah, this affective wiring we were talking about before of how they sense from the carrier, that's their truth.
Right.
That's the truth. And then there's this other thing surfacing, varying on the surface, which is this informational artificial learning, but the other stuff's real.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you segued into this because on the one hand, though we're deep into trying to understand the cognitive ambiguity overwhelm that's stuttering reading, on the one side. On the other side, one of the most fascinating things I think about all of this is connected to what you were just describing in self-esteem, which is that human organism, back to where we began, has certain affects, biological, emotional precursors that are what direct our attention, the ground of fear and shame and so forth. And one of the biggest problems that we're continuing to see now is what we call the downward spiral of shame. Yeah. The very moment that a child just crosses a threshold of feeling shame in relation to a complex cognitive process, especially a complex unconscious cognitive process like reading, then it actually burns up the brain resources necessary to do that task.
You're darn right.
So
if you feel that you just can't do it.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean in your head. In your heart, you can't do it.
And
if
there's
you feel that you can't do. You're not going to even try. You're never going to get there.
Now you're talking about shame avoidance. Yes. So that's. But even at the microtime level of the processing going on inside the brain, the moment that shame kicks or one of these affects kick, it knocks out our ability to do the cognitive processing. So the moment we start to become ashamed of it, it actually debilitates our ability to do the processing. The more that we lose our ability to do the processing, the more shame, and there's this downward spiral.
Yeah, well, when you're going to talk to parents about it, you don't use that language.
No, I won't use that language. But I'm going to connect them up to. I mean, all of us are walking examples of what happens when shame hits.
Yeah, one of the things that used to drive me crazy when I was practicing, parents wanting to inject self-esteem.
Yes.
Yeah, I kept saying, you can't put it there. It's a product. Self-esteem is a product of success. It's not something you can inject. I can't give you a pill for it.
You know, I'm about 90% in agreement with you. Certainly they cannot inject it. No question. I happen to be blessed with being a participant in a kind of national self-esteem dialogue a year and a half ago with a number of folks. And bottom line is that I agree with your sense, and what I was doing in relation to the self-esteem group is say, look, we would be naturally... I mean, the issue is not the accumulation of stuff in order to have a good self-image, self-esteem. Right. It's the lack of accumulating self-negative. It's that in other words, self-esteem isn't something to build up. It's something that we would have if we didn't learn otherwise.
Yeah.
And that we learn otherwise in relation to these experiences that we're talking about now. Particularly, I mean, you can't have kids going... The bottom line of all of this for me is it seems to me that we have many to most of our children being placed in environments which are unnaturally confusing to their nature and in which they're feeling as if there's something wrong with them because they're confused. Mm-hmm. And that's just a spiral into disempowerment.
Yeah, and it can come in many directions. Clumsiness.
Mm-hmm.
Can destroy a child's desire to learn and ability to learn.
Yes.
People don't, there are a lot of little things that can happen, but those are the negatives that you're talking about.
Right.
The accumulation of negatives.
Yeah. Yeah, that become ashamed of what happens when we become ashamed of something is we don't want to do it. Like you were saying before, we don't want to do it. So once we start to get ashamed of learning, what happens to us?
I had one patient who went to a parochial school. This was a long time ago in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And because he was asked to read out loud in class daily and couldn't, he was put in a dress and the teacher made him sit under her desk.
Oh.
Yeah. So I marched up to the school and said my piece to this brat woman, and we took him out of the school. So, you can kill a kid like this. This is a real, to me, this is a form of child abuse that's people should be punished for.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And that's
I have one of my favorite stories about a little guy who was at the time maybe 9. He was a sculptor.
Uh-huh.
And this kid, we called him Clay because he always had clay in his hair and his teeth and his nails. He was always working with clay. And his mom had 3 children, 2 of whom had learning problems. And she would come in every 6 weeks. Since I was on salary, I could give her an hour at a time. It didn't matter. And she gave in this time screaming her head off because Clay, or his name was Kent, had just flunked art. I said, how could he flunk art?
Yeah, that's it.
Sculptor. So she's going on and on. She finally ran down, and I went out to get Clay. He was in the lobby, and while he was waiting to come in, he made me a horse. It's this beautiful little horse. It was about 5 inches and about wide and about 3 inches tall. It had a saddle. It had the bridle. It had the flowing mane and the flowing tail and the stirrups, the whole works. And I said, Clay, how could you possibly have flunked art if you can do this? He says, well, in her class we have to paint.
Yeah.
And I said, well, did you explain to the teacher that you're in special ed and you have a few problems? He said, yeah. He said, I told her. And this was a 9-year-old. He says, I told her, I don't work in 2 dimensions. I work in 3 dimensions.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's another one. I took the horse up to school and talked to this broad and explained that we're removing him from her class because this guy has grown up. This is what's nice about getting to be an old pediatrician. You know what happens to your patients. He's a very successful architect. And he still doesn't work in 2 dimensions. He hires draftsmen. He makes models of his buildings.
Yes. How about that? What a great story.
This one she could have just squashed him.
Yeah. Well, he had sounds to me, even in his exchange with you, he had the kind of internal self-referencing strength to not be shamed out by her response to him.
Yeah,
that's the thing I wish more kids had, and unfortunately a lot don't.
I know. Did you read that Fortune magazine, the issue last year on dyslexic CEOs?
No, I didn't. I've read stuff about other. I've read a similar article, I believe, but I don't remember that one.
I believe this was such a breakthrough. This was Fortune magazine, and it was the cover. Dyslexic CEOs, and it had a picture of Charles Schwab, I think, when he was a kid on the cover. And it discussed all of them. And one of the most impressive to me was Boyce, the lawyer who defeated Microsoft. David Boyce, B-O-I-E-S. We brought him down to Jacksonville to a conference, and he was incredible because he flew down from Michigan in his own plane, didn't charge us a penny, came down and talked about growing up with dyslexia. The only time he broke was when he mentioned his son and said that the most difficult thing for him was not his own problem, but when he saw that his son was going to go through the same thing. And yet both he and his son are Yale graduates in law and have done extremely well. But this is another aspect of the reading problem, the genetics.
Yes. That's
tremendous. It's not always easy to reach the parents if they're in denial, which they often are. Talking about self-esteem.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, the reading aversion, I've had conversations with Robert Wedgeworth at Pro Literacy, and they're about to release, research basically was studying the kind of commerce and consumer behavior of adults that have reading difficulties. And it translates right, the bottom line is shame. That everywhere they go, they're trying to hide that. And that they're going into a supermarket or a department store. They're constantly figuring out how can they make sure they get out of here without revealing that they don't know what they bought or how much it costs.
Well, the bright ones, I wish, you know, the interesting thing to me is that every one of these very successful men, Orifalea was one, he's the guy who's Kinko.
Yes.
And each of them talked about the fact that they had such complete support from their parents. And they felt that this was the major thing that helped them to become successful people.
Yeah, which kept them from shaming out.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't, from what I've read, it was in part.
Also, it's not just that kept them from shaming out. It's not just shame, because, damn it, a lot of them, they don't get shame to the extent that we've been talking about. Maybe they feel bad about this problem, but they get mad at it. And they also have an ability, a lot of these dyslexic kids that I've known over the years have an ability to see around, they think around corners.
Yes.
They can get to conclusions more rapidly than I can, and but they can't tell me how they did it.
Yes. Their mind hasn't been formatted with the reading thing in a way that's working against that.
Well, or the kids who can do the math in their heads. I had one patient who could do three numbers times three numbers in his head, but he flunked math because he wouldn't do it the way the teacher wanted him to do it.
Yeah.
So that, you know, in the kids who have math problems are part of the reading problem. Because we have children who have difficulty with math, not because they can't understand the concepts, but they can't do the mechanics because they mix up the lines when they're, you know, adding and subtracting and so on. Yeah,
my daughter, that was the problem for her.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And being able to read the, you know, the word problems to extract the math problems.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we've
Great
sort of talked around a lot.
Yeah, we have, and I appreciate that. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is open a channel between us, so that as I move forward here with the other interviews and what have you, questions are always popping. And now that I have a sense of you and your interests and background, if it's okay with you, I'd like to be able to have a kind of an email you from time to time with things that have come up that you might have an angle on or a point of view on, and then if you're interested, arrange to do a video interview with you when we get back east.
Well, I'm fine on it. All of it except on the video thing. Would you ask the photographer to put gauze on the lens?
I was talking to Martin Haberman yesterday. I don't know if you know the name. And he had the same thing. The same thing.
Well, if they did it for Doris Day, I don't see why they couldn't do it for other people.
There you go. All right. Well, we'll work on that part of it.
Okay.
It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
Do you have my title?
No. No, you didn't. Their email exchange did not include a title.
You want it?
Please.
Well, I'm Clinical Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics.
Okay.
And Distinguished Professor of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Are you ready?
Yes.
University of South Florida in Tampa. I'm retired.
Excellent. And you're the past president of the IRA?
Both ASHA and IDA. And MACE, which is the Multidisciplinary Academy for Clinical Education, is MACE.
Is there? That's
the small group.
That's a small group. Do you have any sense of? I mean, what I asked a friend for who could I talk to kind of be my open door channeling into the world of Orton and the world of IDA and how it got there, and you were the one. Are there other people there that you think would be appropriate for me to talk to in order to include more of that organization in our series?
Yeah, if you want to get somebody who is also into the history
Mm-hmm.
of how it came about and who's been working in the field ever since it started, it's Roger Saunders. Saunders. He's very willing to talk to people. He's a psychologist. He has had his own clinics. He has worked with these kids. He has established was one of the people who established a program in New England for adults with dyslexia.
Good, I'll check out.
He's one of the old timers. He was one of the founders, an early president.
One of the other things that I'm interested in is making sure that the people in IDA would recognize the names of some of the IDA people that we work with, so that it draws their interest into this conversation.
They would recognize Roger Saunders.
Okay, good, good.
Very quickly.
Good.
You want his address and stuff?
If you've got it.
Yeah. It's Roger Saunders, 9 Forest Drive,
okay,
Lexington, North Carolina,
okay,
27292.
27292.
His phone number is 336-243-8914.
Excellent.
Then you need also, you want the current president?
Sure. What do you think of the current president?
I think she's good.
Okay.
She's originally from New Jersey, and she ran the special ed stuff there. Whatever her title was, I don't remember. She's well known. They would recognize her. It's Nancy Hennessy. She's harder to get hold of, though. I shouldn't give you her because she's on the road all the time.
Do you have her email address?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I use your name as a door knock,
yes,
so to speak?
God, yes.
Okay. All right.
No, I don't have her email. Shoot. I can give you her phone number and her address.
Okay.
Okay, she's at it's Nancy Hennessy, is Henn, like nuts, ESS, like sugar, Y.
Okay.
1008. Martin, _S, Point Road.
Okay.
Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And the zip is 27949. And the phone number is 252-261-5329. And right now, oh, wait a minute, I have got her email. Hang on.
Okay, thank you.
We've been part of, I'm also on the National Joint Committee for LD. And she and I represent Orton on that, or IDA, whatever. As soon as I can get this, I'll get it to you. Wrong thing. Wait a minute. I hope that the money is coming out of a grant for you.
Actually, we are supported by private individuals.
You're kidding.
Yeah, and we are in conversation to raise money from foundations as we get further down the road with this. But we have done the first wave of interviews and all of the web work and phone work and research work on our own.
Good God.
Well, we didn't want to be the puppet of a particular perspective.
Well, that makes good sense. I notice you've got a guy named Allington as one of your interviewees.
we've yeah, and it was a great exercise environment for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that I had the same thing with Stephen Krashen.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So I like to go in and hear the best arguments for every different competing view.
Well, you need them.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. The reading wars, as it were, it go on forever.
Yes.
It's been going forever.
They got to stop.
Yeah, you know, in the beginning, to me, it was, you talked about the Greeks and the Romans. The Romans didn't teach reading. They taught writing, because to them, writing and speaking, oration, speaking and writing were the two important ways of being citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite guy was Quintilian.
Right.
90 A.D. He taught the Roman soldiers to write using tablets with the letters grooved in them and a stylus that went in the groove. So that was a kinesthetic method of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And when he started, he used wax tablets, but he had to change that because in Rome it gets very hot in the summer.
Well, that's a modern equivalent of recording, right?
Right. Anyhow, Hennessy, here it is.
Okay.
Okay, it's Hennessy, HENNESSY, at N like nuts, NAC.net.
Okay, excellent.
Good.
Thank you so much. What a delight and a pleasure and an honor to have an opportunity to talk with you.
Well, I have enjoyed this tremendously. I was a little nervous about it, but I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.
You're very special.
Thank you. So are you. And I look forward to having a more conversation, either in person or on the phone again in the future, huh?
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Have a great one. Bye.
Bye-bye.